Haven Arrest Missionary Baptist Church Sunday School Lesson number 10, Sunday, May 7th, 2017. The lesson is entitled God's Disciplinary Love. The lesson comes from Jonah, chapter 1, verses 7 through 17, and we were asked to read the same. The place is Joppa. The time is about 780 BC. We conclude our conversation of God's love with a 4-lesson study on the extent of God's love from the book of Jonah. We often do not think of God's love when we think of Jonah, but it is clearly evident throughout the book. In the first 2 lessons, we will examine God's love for the prophet Jonah. We will see how God's love led him to discipline Jonah and then to protect him. Through these studies, help your learners appreciate the extent of God's love. Today's aim, facts. To understand that our sinfulness and disobedience will lead to God's discipline of us. Principle, to realize that God's disciplines us because he loves us as his children. Application, to accept any discipline from God as an evidence of his love for us. Illustrating the lesson, we should respond to God's disciplinary love. Practical points. 1. People often look to superstition and luck for answers they should seek from God, Jonah 1 through 7. 2. God's people must always be aware that their sins may affect and endanger others, verse 8. 3. Disobedience damages our relationship with God and others, but does not change who we are, verse 9. 4. No one can outrun God, verses 10 through 11. 5. God uses the experiences and mistakes of our lives to teach others about himself, verses 12 through 14. 6. God clearly reveals his power and will so that those who do not know him can see him and believe, verses 15 through 17. Golden text. Now the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Jonah 1:17. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. 1. A huge problem, Jonah 1:7 through 9. 2. A frightening prospect, Jonah 1:10 through 12. 3. A shocking resolution, Jonah 1:13 through 17. Introduction. Doing God's will is a simple matter for his children, right? All we have to do is know what that will is, then carry it out, right? That will always be the easiest way to happiness, right? With truths like this before us, we are always eager to know what God wants us to do, right? Unfortunately, it rarely seems to work quite that easily, as every believer knows. Sometimes God's will is difficult, either because of something we have done wrong or because of a new direction in life. Those of us who have sought to run from doing God's will know that it is impossible to escape from his presence and determination. When his will is easy and pleasant, we are eager to fulfill it. But when it demands something difficult, or our natural propensity is to try to run from it or ignore it. Jonah tried to run, but God's love for him was too great to escape, and he sought him out and gave him another chance to obey. That shows us what kind of God we serve, and we should be very grateful. A huge problem, Jonah 1:7. And they said, everyone to his fellow, come and let us cast lots, that we may know for whose cause this evil is upon us. So they cast lots, and the lot fell upon Jonah. Verse 8. Then said they unto him, tell us, we pray thee, for whose cause this evil is upon us. What is thine occupation, and whence comest thou? What is thy country, and of what people art thou? Verse 9. And he said unto them, I am Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, which have made the sea and the dry land. Jonah chosen. Jonah 1:7. Jonah had already been chosen by God to preach a warning message to the city of Nineveh, one of the most prominent cities of Assyria. Assyria was an evil nation with a brutal army. Jonah's message of warning to be spoken to a foreign nation is the only such message among all of Israel's prophets. Other nations had prophecies directed against them, but only Jonah was commissioned to go and give a direct message from God. Because of their wickedness, Jonah did not want to do what God said this time. In a ridiculously impossible attempt to flee from God's presence, Jonah headed in the opposite direction. Success was not a remote possibility, of course, because God is omnipresent and no escape is ever possible. Still, Jonah was in a ship going west instead of east, was down in the hold taking a nap, and was apparently satisfied that he was accomplishing his escape. If God were not a loving God, maybe this would have worked. But God loved Jonah too much to let him escape his will and go his own way. He also loved the people of Nineveh too much not to give them a warning of impending judgment. In order to stop Jonah, therefore, God hurled a storm unto the sea, causing even seasoned sailors to panic and begin to cry out to every god they had heard of. After being scolded by the ship's captain, Jonah faced the crowd of sailors who decided to cast lots to find out why they were facing such desperate circumstances. Someone on board had obviously displeased his God, and something had to be done about it. For a second time, Jonah was chosen, but this time as a target rather than as a special messenger. Even though the pagan sailors did not know God, God oversaw the casting of lots to reveal the truth to them. All eyes were soon on Jonah. Jonah guilty. Jonah 1:8 through 9. As soon as the lot fell on Jonah, the sailors began to interrogate him in hopes of determining the cause for the life-threatening storm they were facing. They had sensed that the storm was of divine origin and needed to know about Jonah's connections with his God. What was behind this storm? What was Jonah's occupation? Where had he come from? And what was his country and nationality? What they wanted to find out was any possible connection to their current problem. Jonah was completely straightforward with his responses. He first told them he was a Hebrew, a term often used by foreigners as a destination for an Israelite. It is the term, for example, that Potiphar's wife used in referring to Joseph, Genesis 39:14. It was also the term Moses used when he went to Pharaoh to demand the release of the Israelites from Egypt, Exodus 3:18, 1 Samuel 4:6, 9:14-11. For Jonah to call himself a Hebrew was the clearest distinction he could make for these sailors. He then stated clearly in his belief in and fear of Yahweh, Israel's God. Jonah's description of God as the one who had made the sea and dry land was especially powerful to these men. Most of them were probably Baal worshippers and considered Baal to be the god of the sky and in control of weather. Now, however, they were traveling on the sea that Jonah claimed was made by God. If he had made it and controlled it, the storm must indeed be evidence that Jonah had done something significant to displease him. They appear to have been closer to this realization than Jonah was. We are about to see from his next words of instruction that it is possible he was still not accepting the fact that there was no escape from God. A frightening prospect. Verse 10. Then were the men exceedingly afraid and said unto him, Why hast thou done this? For the men knew that he fled from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Verse 11. Then said they unto him, What shall we do unto thee, that the sea may be calm unto us? For the sea wrought and tempestuous. Verse 12, and he said unto them, take me up and cast me forth into the sea, so shall the sea be calm unto you. For I know that for my sake this great tempest is upon you. Greater fear, Jonah 1:10. It is possible that Jonah had previously mentioned to the sailors that he was running from his God, but if not, he told them now. What apparently caused their extreme fear was the information that it was Jonah's God who was the creator of the sea. These two bits of information together explain the rolling sea. It was God who made the sea, and Jonah was running from him. Jonah's God was after him, and because of his presence on the ship, he was after the sailors too. None of them had any ideas about how to appease this foreign God. They clearly were up against a very powerful deity. As evidenced by the increasingly strong raging of the water, it therefore appeared to be a totally hopeless situation for all of them. They had no doubt battled bad seas before, but never one that so clearly indicated a divine cause for which there was no known solution. Jonah 1:10. They were exceedingly afraid, a word from a Hebrew root indicating their minds were twisted with stark raving terror. Why had Jonah done this to them? How unbelievable it must have seemed to these men that if Jonah served a God that powerful, he would try something so ridiculous as running from him. What sheer folly it was to take a sea voyage to run from the very God who, by Jonah's own testimony, had created that sea. The men had been fearing the sea, but now they began to fear Jonah's God. Lest we unduly blame Jonah, we should ask ourselves whether we have ever presented a wrong portrait of God by how we live. Maybe we have been inconsistent like Jonah. Drastic solution, Jonah 1:11 through 12. The sailors might have known what to do with Jonah had he been a criminal guilty of some crime against persons, or if he had accidentally transgressed a law of his God. However, he was guilty of being a servant of his God and directly disobeying the Lord's order to him. They had no idea what would placate the creator of the sea in such a case, so they asked Jonah, since he knew his God. Talk about being between a rock and a hard place. These sailors were facing a raging sea that was obviously of divine origin, and finding out it was coming from God they knew nothing about. What were they supposed to do with a man who was being deliberately disobedient? What would it take to appease his God in this case? Their only hope was that he might know and could give them the solution, so they asked him. They were also becoming more desperate, for the sea was becoming more violent. Jonah knew he was the cause of the raging sea and therefore had to suffer the consequences of his action. He would have to give his life. We wonder, though, was he still persistently running from God? After all, he could have submitted to him and asked the sailors to take him back to land immediately so that he could do what God had commanded. Is it possible that Jonah preferred to die than to take God's message to Nineveh? At least he knew that his absence from the boat would save the sailors. To the sailors, his solution probably made sense. In their minds, the God only the sea was angry, and if they would feed him with this man, he might be appeased. Jonah's admission of guilt caused a quandary for them, but it is evident that he was probably right. A shocking resolution. Verse 13. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to bring it to the land, but they could not, for the sea wrought and was tempestuous against them. Verse 14. Wherefore they cried unto the Lord, and said, We beseech thee, O Lord, we beseech thee, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not upon us innocent blood. For thou, O Lord, hast done as it pleased thee. Verse 15. So they took up Jonah and cast him forth into the sea, and the sea ceased from her raging. Verse 16. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and offered a sacrifice unto the Lord, and made vows. Verse 17. Now the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah, And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Desperation, Jonah 1:13 through 14. The sailors showed that they had a sense of respect for human life in their unwillingness to do what Jonah said. They might have been seasoned and tough men, but they were not bad. They were not eager to take a life and possibly be guilty of murder. This is quite a contrast to Jonah's attitude about the Ninevites. The sailors were eager to go the extra mile to save the life of one man, while he was unwilling to take God's message to an entire city under threat of destruction. Instead of immediately throwing Jonah overboard, they did their best to return to land. They quickly dug their oars into the water and rowed as hard as they could. It was an impossible task, however. God caused the sea to continually become more and more violent against them, and it soon became evident that they were not going to succeed. It simply is not possible for believers or unbelievers to go against God successfully. He will have his way, whether in this life or in coming judgment. In their desperation, the pagan sailors cried out to Jonah's God. By now they understood that it was indeed God who controlled the sea, so they knew he was their only hope for physical salvation. They would have to do as Jonah had said, but still they did not want to be held guilty for taking a man's life. They begged God to not punish them for what they were about to do, and they pleaded with him not to hold them accountable for taking an innocent man's life. In an amazing confession, they acknowledged that God was in control and was doing as he pleased. It was an absolute submission to the God they were learning about. Salvation, Jonah 1:15 through 16. Once they realized they were fighting a losing battle against the sea and God, the sailors hurled Jonah into the raging waters. The Hebrew word translated cast is the same word translated sent in verse 4. Just as God had hurled the storm onto the sea, so now the sailors pitched Jonah overboard. Everything else they had tried had failed, so they now felt that they had no other choice. They had prayed to their gods and had done their best to row against the sea, but nothing had worked. Suddenly, God had their full attention, because the moment they threw Jonah overboard, the sea became calm. The psalmist knew of this power from God. Ethan the Ezrahite said, "Thou rulest the raging of the sea. When the waves thereof arose, thou stillest them." Psalms 89:9. And the author of Psalms 107 said, "He maketh the storm a calm, so that the waves thereof are still." Verse 29. In Matthew 8:23 through 27, we see Jesus calming the sea just as instantly as when Jonah was cast overboard. This was easy for God. The sudden calm greatly increased the fear of the sailors, but it was an obvious revelation to them that the God Jonah served was far more powerful than they expected. Their fear was combined with the sense of awe, for God had just done what none of their gods were capable of doing. It also proved that Jonah had been right in acknowledging his wrongdoing and in giving them the solution to the problem. This led them to offer a sacrifice to God and to make vows to him. We cannot conclude with certainty, however, that these pagan polytheists became exclusive worshipers of God at this time, though it certainly is a possibility. Maybe their vows involved a complete change of attitude toward him. They did show true character in their fear and honor of God, which at the time exceeded what Jonah had been showing. The Believer's Study Bible concludes this section by stating, "These verses 4 through 16 provide an interesting study by way of contrast between Jonah and the mariners. In spite of the mariners' lack of past experience with Yahweh, they display more apparent sensitivity to God and more compassion toward man than does Jonah." Preparation, Jonah 1:17. God knew the outcome of the entire situation before Jonah and the sailors, so he had prepared for the inevitable. The word translated prepared means to appoint or to enroll in service. God had a job for his chosen fish too, so he led it to the right place at the right time. It was not by accident or good luck that the fish was where it was at just the time, at just the instant Jonah hit the water. The sovereign God was showing his presence and protection. Jonah could have said with the psalmist, "The Lord have chastened me sore, but he have not given me over unto death." Psalms 118:18. God prepared a great fish to swallow Jonah and protect his life for 3 days and 3 nights. How good it is that we serve a loving, forgiving God who often gives us second chances. The fish was not a punishment, but a means to rescue Jonah from drowning. This text shows that God is in control of every detail. It reveals that his love for his children, even when they err or rebel, will become a disciplinary love when needed. Questions. 1. How was Jonah chosen twice in the first chapter of this book? 2. Why did Jonah not want to obey God this time, and what did he do in an attempt to disobey? 3. Why did the sailors interrogate Jonah after the casting of lots pointed to him? 4. What 2 bits of information caused them to fear God greatly? 5. What dilemma did Jonah's presence on board pose for the crew? 6. What do you think was behind Jonah's reply that a solution was to throw him into the sea? 7. What did the sailors try to do in lieu of what Jonah had recommended? 8. What did they do when they saw that there was no other option? 9. What happened when Jonah hit the water, and what did the sailors do then? 10. How did God protect Jonah? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for May 7, 2017. Thank you for listening. God bless.